My mother wrote me a final letter before she died, but at her funeral, my uncle snatched it from my hands and tossed it into the fire. He looked me in the eye and said, "You don't deserve closure." That letter was just her guilt talking. For years, I carried the ashes of words I never read. Until one day, I decided to find her voice again, not in paper, but in something the flames couldn't touch. If you've ever lost someone and felt like the truth was stolen from you, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, healing begins when we speak the pain out loud. My name is Lauren Reed. I'm 35 now, but for most of my life, I felt like a question mark in a story I didn't write. I was raised by my mother, Susan, just the two of us. No siblings, no father in the picture, and no grandparents who sent cards or called on holidays. Our little rented house in rural Oregon was quiet and full of books, plants, and the occasional thrift store lamp with a crooked shade. It wasn't much, but Mom made it warm. She gave me everything she had: her time, her laughter, her fierce belief that I mattered. But outside those walls, I learned early on that being the daughter of a single mother came with invisible ink on your back, labels, whispers, judgments. The cruelest of them came from within the family. My uncle, my mother's younger brother David, was a constant reminder that we were an embarrassment to the Reeds. He had a real estate business, a country club membership, and a voice that always sounded like he was delivering a verdict. Whenever he visited, which wasn't often, he made sure to mention my lack of a father, like it was a personal failing. "Still no birthday card from dear old Dad, huh?" He'd chuckle, sipping his scotch. Mom always smiled tightly when he said those things. She never responded. She just turned to me with those eyes that said, "Don't give him the power." But I felt it anyway. When I was in middle school, I asked Mom why no one else in the family ever came around. She hesitated, then said something I never forgot. "Sometimes, honey, silence is the only safe boundary left." As I got older, I understood. My mother had chosen me over their approval. She'd chosen her own voice, her own path, even if it meant losing the family she was born into, and she paid the price in cold shoulders and awkward holiday calls that never came. Still, she never spoke poorly of them. She didn't dwell. She just poured herself into raising me. She worked nights at the public library, then took on extra shifts as a part-time receptionist at a local dental clinic. Somehow, she always had time to help me with school projects or listen to my rants about teenage drama like they were breaking news. We were each other's everything. And then, she got sick. At first it was fatigue and headaches. Then came the diagnosis: ovarian cancer, stage 3. The kind of news that changes the room you're in, even the way light hits the furniture. It was a slow unraveling: chemotherapy, nausea, hospital stays. Her voice grew thinner, but her spirit didn't. Even in her worst moments, she kept saying, "We'll beat this, Lore. Just you wait." But we didn't beat it. 3 years. That's how long we fought. In the final months, she moved into hospice. I spent every evening with her, reading old poems, playing her favorite jazz records, brushing her hair with that same wooden brush she used on me as a child. Uncle David visited twice. The first time, he brought lilies and stayed for 7 minutes. The second time, he came alone, didn't sit down, and told her she should have asked for help sooner. He said it like she'd failed a business transaction, not her own health. Mom looked so small in that hospital bed, but her eyes were sharp when she replied, "Help with strings isn't help, it's control, and I never wanted that." That was the last time he saw her alive. She passed away on a Tuesday morning. I was holding her hand, whispering the lyrics of an old Joni Mitchell song she loved. The grief didn't hit all at once. It dripped in slowly, like water from a leaking faucet. Some days I was numb. Others, I couldn't breathe. The funeral was simple, just how she wanted. No big church, no floral arches, Just a memorial gathering in the park near our house, the one where she used to bring me hot cocoa in winter and sit on the bench by the duck pond. And that's where everything changed. After the service, while people milled around hugging and murmuring soft words, a nurse approached me. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a tremble in her voice. She said my mother had written a letter during her final week. A personal goodbye meant only for me. She handed me a sealed envelope, slightly worn around the edges. My heart leapt. My fingers shook. But before I could even open it, David appeared, out of nowhere. He snatched the envelope from my hands like a seagull grabbing bread. His face twisted into that familiar smirk, patronizing and cold. "You don't need to read that," he said, holding the envelope high. "She only wrote it because she felt guilty, not because she loved you. You'll be better off without it." Then, in front of everyone, without pause, he walked to the edge of the park, where a memorial flame burned, and dropped the letter into the fire. I stood there, frozen. The words my mother left me, the final part of her voice, gone, just like that. David turned to me, hands in his pockets, and added, "Closure is a crutch. Time to grow up." No one said anything. No one stopped him. That was the moment something inside me broke, but not in the way he thought. He believed he'd silenced her, but I knew better, and I was going to prove it. I didn't cry when he burned the letter, not because I wasn't devastated, but because something else took over. Something colder. Still. Focused. Shock is a strange thing. You watch an unthinkable moment unfold, and your body moves slower than the world around you. It was like time folded in on itself. The orange flicker of the memorial flame eating the edges of the envelope, the smell of burning paper curling around the soft spring air. That letter was the last piece of my mother's voice. The final thoughts she chose for me. Not for a doctor, not for a will, not for anyone else. Just for me. And it was gone in seconds. The few guests who witnessed it stood in stunned silence. Some looked away. No one said a word to him. No one came to me. It was like they didn't want to be involved in family drama. But it wasn't drama. It was cruelty. Calculated, surgical cruelty. I walked home alone that day. The house felt emptier than ever. Her scent still lingered. Lavender lotion, black coffee, that subtle trace of mint she always kept in her purse. I sat on her old reading chair, knees pulled up, staring at the spot on the wall where a picture of us once hung. It had fallen during her last month, and I never had the heart to put it back up. I should have fought him. I should have screamed. I should have run after him, grabbed the letter, something, anything. But I hadn't, and the guilt of that silence gnawed at me. For days after, I moved through life like I was underwater. I couldn't sleep. I barely ate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her handwriting turning to ash. And that voice, David's voice, echoed over and over in my head. She only wrote it because she felt guilty, not because she loved you. What if he was right? That single thought was poison. It seeped into the corners of my memories. Was all her love some performance of regret? Did she pity me more than she cherished me? No, I knew better. No, I knew. My mother wasn't perfect, but she was real, and she loved me with a quiet, steady kind of love that never had to prove itself. Which meant that letter had meaning, which meant he had taken something sacred, and he didn't get to do that without consequence. That's when something shifted in me. Not just anger, not just grief, but purpose. I remembered something the nurse had said, right before giving me the envelope. She wrote it late at night during her final week. I believe she asked the chaplain to help her organize it with her wishes. It was important to her. That one sentence lit a match in my brain. The chaplain, hospice records. The letter might be gone, But if it was part of her documented end-of-life planning, then maybe, just maybe, there was a version somewhere. Maybe not the handwritten words, but the content. I didn't wait. The next morning, I went to the hospice center. My palms were sweating as I walked through the same hallway where I'd once wheeled her out into the garden for fresh air. I asked to speak with the coordinator, and when I explained who I was, her expression softened immediately. "We remember your mother very well," she said. "She was thoughtful, very organized." I asked about her final wishes, specifically, if there was any documentation about a personal letter to me. The woman hesitated. "Legally, I can't show you anything without formal authorization, unless it was part of her public declaration or care directive." I felt the hope slipping, but then she added, "However, if it was recorded in the presence of a chaplain, there might be a transcript. Would you like me to check?" Would I? 15 minutes later, she returned with a file. In it were several documents, one of which was a typed note titled, "Letter to my daughter, for Lauren, when I'm gone." It wasn't the envelope. It wasn't her handwriting, but it was her. I sat there in the quiet waiting room and read. The letter began simply, "If you're reading this, I'm not where you can reach me, but I hope I'm still close in ways that matter." And then she told me all the things a daughter needs to hear. That she was proud of me. That I had become the kind of woman she'd always dreamed I'd be. That she had no regrets, not one, about choosing me over approval. That loving me had never once felt like a sacrifice. She even acknowledged the pain of our family's distance. If David tries to rewrite this moment, let him. He has always feared what he can't control. But you, my love, were never his to control. Tears streamed down my face. I made a copy. I made two. Then I walked out of that hospice facility with a new fire in my chest. He thought he'd burned the story, but he'd only burned the ink. The words lived on. And I was going to make sure they were heard. But not in a courtroom, not with lawyers, not with some bitter back and forth. No, I was going to do it on my own terms, with her words and my voice, together. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. There were no fantasies of lawsuits or screaming matches at family gatherings. I didn't want to shame David publicly just to make a point. That would have made me like him, loud, controlling, desperate to be seen. No, what I wanted was simple. I wanted to restore what he tried to destroy, and I knew exactly how to do it. I had the hospice's printed transcript of my mother's final letter. It wasn't the version she'd written in her own hand, but the words were there, clear as daylight. Her tone, her phrasing, her quiet strength, all of it still intact. So I did what any grieving millennial with a laptop and some stubborn resolve would do. I opened a blank document, and I started writing. Not just her letter, but everything. The day he burned it, the way the envelope curled in the flame, the silence from the people around us, the years of subtle cruelty and judgment from a man who thought love made you weak. And I paired her words with mine. My memories, my grief, my rage, my healing. For 2 weeks straight, I barely left the house. I wrote during the day and edited at night. I recorded voiceovers using a cheap USB microphone, then re-recorded them when I didn't like the tone of my voice. I dug through old videos and photos of my mom, clips of her dancing in the kitchen, laughing with a scarf around her head during chemo, reading a children's book to a younger me on the couch. Piece by piece, it became something more than just a project. It became a tribute, a reclamation. I titled it, "The Letter That Burned." And I didn't post it on YouTube or blast it across social media with hashtags and taglines. That would have been too easy and too noisy. I wanted it to live quietly, like she did. I uploaded it to Vimeo under an anonymous name. No comments, no likes, no real profile. Just the story. Then I sent the link to 3 people. One was the hospice nurse who gave me the letter, Another was my old college roommate, who now ran a small grief support group online. And the last was to myself. A copy. For the future. For the days I'd forget her voice. For a while, I didn't think anything would come of it. It was just a small release into the digital void. A private offering. But 2 weeks later, my former roommate messaged me. "Lauren," she wrote, "I shared your video with a few members in my group. They asked if they could pass it along. It's really beautiful. It made me cry. It helped me." I told her yes, of course. That's all I ever wanted. Within a month, the link had made its way into quiet circles, bereavement blogs, private grief forums, even a subreddit for adult orphans. I started getting messages through an anonymous contact form I had linked at the end of the video. People thanking me. People saying it helped them say goodbye. People who had their own letter that burned. I didn't reply to most. I just read, absorbed, let it sink in that maybe, just maybe, my mother's voice had made it after all. And then one night, I got a message from a woman named Jessica. She worked with a nonprofit dedicated to mental health and end-of-life care advocacy. She said the video had been shared by a counselor on their team and had made a deep impression. They were organizing a small digital storytelling panel for National Grief Awareness Day and wanted me to be part of it. I froze. I had never spoken publicly about anything like this. My voice cracked reading poetry in high school, but this felt different. I said yes. The panel was virtual. Just me, 3 other speakers, and about 50 people in a Zoom room. I wore a soft gray sweater and had a framed photo of my mother behind me. I told the story, not as a performance, but as an offering. No dramatic retellings, just truth. When I read her letter aloud, people cried. One woman turned off her camera to sob. Someone messaged me afterward to say, "That was the goodbye I never got. Thank you." And then it hit me. David had tried to silence my mother's voice, but all he'd really done was make me amplify it. And I wasn't finished yet. I didn't expect it to spread. After the panel, I thought things would quiet down again. I'd done what I needed to do, shared her words, honored her voice, let a few hearts find shelter in the same letter that had once been burned to ash. But healing has a strange echo. When it's honest, people recognize it. They pass it on. The video link started showing up in unexpected places. A therapist messaged me, saying she'd used "The Letter That Burned" in a grief workshop with veterans. A college grief counseling center reached out, asking for permission to include it in their resource library. I received an email from a high school teacher who had played it for her senior class during a unit on personal narratives. And then came the blog articles. Small, quiet write-ups on mental health sites. A feature in an online grief journal. Even a repost on Medium titled, "What Survives the Fire? A Daughter's Goodbye." It wasn't fame. It wasn't viral in the way the internet defines viral. But it was seen. And with every new share, the pain that David tried to erase became something alive. Something useful. Something beautiful. Of course, he noticed. It started with a phone call. Unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. "Lauren?" That voice, flat, clipped, just a little too calm. It was David. "I came across something. A video. A story. You've been sharing your mother's words." He said words like they were toxic. I stayed silent. "You need to take it down," he said. "It's reflecting poorly on the family." I laughed not because it was funny, but because of how absurd it was. "What family?" I asked. "The one that abandoned her? Or the one that burned her goodbye to me?" His voice sharpened. "You're making us look heartless. People are asking questions. My clients, my colleagues. This is not the kind of attention we want." There it was, the real reason. Not remorse, not concern for legacy. Image. David's kingdom was built on perception. He'd always cared more about appearances than people. In his world, vulnerability was weakness. Grief was private. Love was conditional. I told him I wouldn't remove the video. He raised his voice. "This is emotional blackmail, Lauren." "No," I said. "It's memory. It's truth. And you don't get to bury that just because it makes you uncomfortable." Click. A few days later, I received a cease and desist letter. It was laughable. An empty legal threat, citing defamation of character and emotional distress. There were no names in the video, no direct accusations, only story, truth, and one burning flame. I sent the letter to a lawyer friend who confirmed what I already knew. David had no case, just noise. But now I was angry. Not just for me, not just for my mother, but for every person who'd ever been told they didn't deserve closure. So I decided to go further. I reached out to the grief nonprofit again, the one that had hosted the panel. I told them I wanted to organize a screening and storytelling night. In person, small venue, safe space. They said yes. The event was held in a rented studio downtown. Folding chairs, soft lighting, dozens of faces, some red-eyed, some cautious, all carrying their own version of loss. I told my story again, but this time I added the part I'd left out before. The man who burned the letter. I didn't say his name. I didn't need to. The audience didn't care who he was. They cared about what he did, and what I did afterward. And then something happened I never could have planned. A local filmmaker was in the crowd. She approached me after the event, eyes glassy, voice gentle. "I lost my mom to breast cancer 6 years ago," she said. "Your story, it's more than a tribute. It's a screenplay." I blinked. "A what?" "I want to help you turn this into something bigger. A series, maybe. For people like us. For daughters. For anyone who needs to know they're not alone." I didn't say yes right away, but something inside me shifted again, like a door cracking open in a house I thought was locked forever. David tried to erase my mother's voice, but now, that voice was becoming a chorus, and it was only getting louder. Some people think they can burn the truth and walk away, but ashes don't stay silent forever. If this story moved you, drop a comment below. Because every time we speak up, we help someone else reclaim what was taken. I hadn't spoken to David since the cease and desist letter, but I knew he was watching. I could feel it in the way anonymous email accounts started visiting my website, in the vague LinkedIn message from one of his associates, asking where I got the inspiration for my video, in the sudden coldness from one of the family's distant friends, who used to comment heart emojis on old birthday photos and now said nothing at all. The ripples were spreading, and with them, the pressure. Meanwhile, the filmmaker, her name was Mia, moved quickly. Within weeks, she drafted a treatment for a limited series inspired by my story. She changed names, locations, timelines, but the emotional spine remained intact. The story of a daughter silenced, a letter lost, a voice reborn. When she asked if I wanted to be involved as a creative consultant, I hesitated. What if it was too much, too exposed? But then I remembered something my mother once told me, years ago, when I was afraid to read a poem aloud in English class. There's power in letting people see you shake. It reminds them they're allowed to be human too. So I said yes. And the moment I did, everything escalated. Word of the project leaked before I could prepare for it. Mia's agent shared the pitch with a producer friend, who mentioned it in a podcast interview about upcoming female-led grief stories. No names, no confirmation, but it was enough. 2 days later, David called again. This time I didn't answer, so he left a voicemail. "You're really doing this, huh? Turning the family into some Netflix melodrama? You should be ashamed." I saved the message. Not because I needed proof, but because it reminded me how small he sounded when he wasn't in control. A week after that, I got a letter. Not from a lawyer, this time from David himself. Handwritten. Arrogant in tone, but laced with fear. He insisted I was distorting history, that I was dragging a private moment into the public square, that I was profiting from grief. He used the word exploitation. That's when I knew I was winning. Because for men like him, power is in secrecy, in rewriting narratives when no one else is looking, in burning letters and hoping no one ever finds the ashes. But I wasn't hiding anymore. I was preparing to speak. Again. This time at a panel hosted by the National Grief Network. A larger audience. A public one. Media outlets were invited. And I wasn't going to tell a vague version. I was going to say it plainly. Someone tried to silence my goodbye, and I refused to let that be the end of the story. Before the event, I reread the transcript of Mom's letter. I paused on this line. You never needed their permission to feel. You only ever needed the truth. That sentence became my armor. And when I stepped onto that stage, I carried it with me, along with every word he tried to erase. The auditorium wasn't huge, maybe 200 seats. But that night, it felt like the whole world was watching. The National Grief Network's panel was titled, When Goodbye is Taken, Stories of Interrupted Closure. I was the final speaker. I wore black, not for mourning, but for clarity. My voice trembled on the first few sentences, but I kept going. Word by word, breath by breath, I told them the truth. I spoke of a daughter raised by a woman who loved fiercely in quiet ways. I spoke of a final letter that never reached her hands. I spoke of the fire, the silence, the control. And then I paused. I took a folded sheet of paper from my pocket, the transcript. I had read it so many times by now I didn't need to look down, but I did anyway. Because this wasn't just for the audience. This was for him. I looked out into the crowd. Row 4, right side. David was there. I knew he would be. Prideful men rarely stay away when their version of truth is threatened in public. He sat stiffly, arms crossed, face unreadable. But I saw the twitch in his jaw. So I read. If David tries to rewrite this moment, let him. He has always feared what he can't control. But you, my love, were never his to control. The room went silent. You could hear breathing, sniffling, the kind of hush that feels sacred. David shifted in his seat. And I kept going. I told them how the story didn't end in the fire, how I found the words anyway, how I turned them into a film, into something that helped others speak their own grief aloud. I spoke of the cease and desist letter, the accusations, the fear masquerading as authority. And then, I said the one sentence I'd waited years to say, not just to him, but to the world. He burned the letter, but he couldn't burn her love. Applause didn't come right away. People sat with it, let it land. And then, as if on cue, the room rose. Standing ovation. David stood too, but not to clap. He walked out, fast, eyes on the floor. I watched him go. No triumph, no smugness, just peace. He wasn't my villain anymore. He was just a man who chose fear over love, control over connection. And now he had to live with the silence he created, while I, and so many others, finally had a voice. After the event, a reporter approached me. "Do you realize," she said, "how rare this is? To turn pain into something this powerful without ever naming names?" I smiled. "I didn't need to name him," I said. "He named himself the moment he threw that letter into the fire." Later that night, I sat alone on my balcony, the city buzzing quietly below. I lit a small candle, not to mourn, but to honor, not to remember what was lost, but to celebrate what couldn't be destroyed. And in that soft light, I whispered, "She hears me now. loud and clear. In the weeks after the panel, my life didn't suddenly become perfect. Grief still knocked at my door some mornings, unexpected, uninvited. But it no longer felt like a collapse. It felt manageable, named, known. And that made all the difference. The story continued to spread, though never in the viral, flashy way you'd expect. It moved gently, shared between daughters and mothers, therapists and students, strangers in grief circles. The letter that burned became more than a film. It became a quiet anthem. And with it came a strange new freedom. I no longer needed to explain myself. Not to the world, and certainly not to David. He tried once more to contact me, through a formal email this time. He wanted to talk. He said he never meant harm, that emotions were high, and that perhaps we could move forward as a family. But I didn't reply, because silence, when chosen, can be powerful. I wasn't angry anymore, but I was done offering him access to my peace. I began to rebuild life on my terms. The apartment I once dreaded returning to became a space of comfort. I framed a copy of the hospice letter, not the paper itself, but the final line, in simple black script. It hung over my desk. You only ever needed the truth. I turned my guest room into a writing space. The walls were soft cream, the shelves lined with books my mother had loved. I lit a candle every time I wrote, same scent she used to wear, lavender and mint. And I kept writing. Not just about grief, but about healing. Not just about endings, but about what survives them. Mia and I continued developing the series. She was meticulous, compassionate, collaborative. We rewrote scenes, tightened character arcs, protected the emotional core. And when she asked how I wanted the antagonist portrayed, I surprised both of us. Not as a villain, I said, but as someone who feared softness, who mistook love for weakness. She nodded slowly. That might be even more powerful. Because I didn't want revenge to look like cruelty. I wanted it to look like clarity. There's a difference. As the show began pre-production, I received a message from a woman named Emily. She said her father had destroyed her mother's journals after she died. She never got to read a single page, but after watching the video, she started therapy. And for the first time, she wrote her own letter back to her mom. She ended her email with, "He took her pages, but he didn't take her presence. Thank you for showing me that." That to me was justice. Not in courtrooms, not in confrontation, but in restoration. David lost control of the narrative the moment he threw that letter into the fire. He lit the match thinking it would end something. He never imagined it would ignite me. And now, I had rebuilt a life not defined by what I'd lost, but by what I refused to let be erased. Healing didn't come all at once. It arrived like morning light through heavy curtains, soft, patient, unhurried. Some days I woke up and felt completely at peace. Other days, I sat with old photos and cried for the 1,000 little moments I would never get back. But what changed, what truly shifted, was that I no longer felt alone inside my pain. Because through telling my story, I had found others. Others who knew what it meant to be silenced, to be robbed of goodbye, to have grief stolen before it could even begin. And together, we created something stronger than closure. We created connection. One afternoon, I returned to the park where my mother's memorial had been held. The same place where David burned her letter. Spring was just beginning, the air fragrant with new life. Birds nesting, children playing in the distance. I brought with me a small notebook and a pen. Not to write another story, but to write to her. I sat on the same bench by the memorial flame, and I wrote as if she were sitting right beside me, like she always had during my hardest moments. I wrote about everything, the panel, the series, the messages from strangers, the way her words had found their way into so many hearts. And then I wrote this. You always said love survives fire. You were right. It didn't just survive, It multiplied. A breeze picked up, rustling the pages. I smiled, imagining her voice carried in it, light, amused, endlessly proud. I didn't burn the letter. I didn't fold it away. I left it on the bench, not for someone to find, necessarily, but as a symbol of what remains, of what can't be taken, of how something so simple, a letter, can become sacred when it carries love through loss. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a plain envelope and a typed note. I found this video by accident. I never knew your mother, but I wish I had. Thank you for helping me hear her. The letter wasn't signed, just a small pressed flower inside. I held it gently, marveling at how stories, once released, take on lives of their own. They reach people we'll never meet, heal wounds we'll never see, say things we ourselves were never brave enough to speak aloud. That is what legacy truly is. It's not in money, not in titles, not in reputation. It's in the way people feel after they've heard your truth. And mine, it turns out, wasn't just about a stolen letter. It was about reclaiming the right to grieve loudly, to remember boldly, to heal openly. David faded from my life after that. No more letters, no more calls, just silence, the kind he always wanted. But now, the silence was mine, and it was peaceful. The show went into development. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't sensational, but it was honest, raw, real. And I knew, somewhere, somehow, my mother was watching, not from some distant place above, but from every screen where her words echoed, from every person who whispered, "Me too," from every heart that burned and then bloomed. Because when someone tries to erase your story, the most powerful revenge is telling it louder than ever.